Thank you, Las Caherlock, and can I just acknowledge the presence of the Minister for Education and the Minister for State as well, because the majority of my speech will focus on the education announcements yesterday, as obviously the education spokesperson. And can I start on the positives first, Minister, because I know you're probably going to get all the negatives. Well, you will get negatives, but the positives is in relation to the increased funding for the literacy and numeracy. Very much welcome. It's an integral part of our education system, particularly in your own sector, Minister, further education. And even when you talked about the new Apprenticeship Council, which is going to be established, and when we discussed it at committee, I think there was universal agreement that it was to be welcomed. We had some concerns around it, and I think the important thing around expanding the apprenticeship system is that we ensure that when we are training people up, that we're also giving them those secondary skills. And I think that was critical, and that was something that came through from all sides of the House during the committee, that we need to be giving people who are engaged in apprenticeships, if the economy takes a different direction and they find themselves out of work, that we're giving them those secondary skills so they can find employment pretty quickly and not end up long-term unemployed. And I think that was a key point I just wanted to make in relation to the new Apprenticeship Council. In relation to solace and the 5-year strategy, I would agree with the Minister that that whole area has been radically reforming by the previous Minister, but it has issues as well. I mean, we've had correspondence from some of the ETBs. One of them only came into my inbox this morning, where they're facing a financial deficit. And I think they're going right into yourself, Minister, and to seek permission to get an overdraft of 5 million. And they're the types of financial difficulties that the ETBs are facing today. And unless we remove those financial constraints on them, they're not going to achieve what they were established to do. And I agree they have the potential to really transform that particular sector, but we need to fund them properly in order for them to do so. On the education budget, Minister, as I said, I want to welcome the increased funding for the literacy and numeracy. I think it's very important. The number of teachers which were announced yesterday, while some people will spin it as a win for the Labour Party or even for the government in terms of 1,700 new teachers, the reality is it's not going to make any difference to class sizes. You're still going to have class sizes in Kingsale where we have 33 primary students. That's not going to change. It's only there we're meeting the changes in the demographics. Even the new proposal in terms of allocating resources for children with special needs, that is dependent on the 15% cut being reversed. Because I think it's important, and it was one of the PQs I put into your office before the budget, in order to reverse that 15% and to get back to where we were in 2011, would take an additional 1,098 resource teachers at the cost of about 44 million. Now, yesterday's announcement of, I think, just over 400 resource teachers, while welcome, is only going to meet that increased demand. I think an extra 13,000 students next year, Minister. So, as I said, it's not going to do anything to the class sizes. It's not going to alleviate the overcrowding, and that's unfortunate. And if we're serious about education and we're serious about giving students the best opportunities, then we need to have smaller classes. It's proven internationally, the smaller the class, the better the educational outcomes. We have the second highest class sizes in Europe, and that needs to be addressed, Minister. And I know you can't do everything in 1 year, but I would have hoped that something could have been done in that. And also the issue of career guidance counsellors. Due to the cut that took place, I think last year, making them ex-quota, I would have hoped that that would have been addressed. What wasn't in the budget yesterday, Minister, and which is of huge concern and disappointment to every school across the state, was the Budget 2012 announcements in relation to the capitation grants. And we're seeing another further 1% cut across the sector next year. That's going to have devastating consequences, not just for schools, but for parents who are going to be asked by boards of management to fill that financial gap now, which has been created by a decrease in funding. We have already got voluntary contributions which are in excess of €120, €130 to try and meet funding shortfalls that schools are facing. That's going to increase next year. In your own ministerial brief, and I said this to you previously, Minister, last week during question time, in your own ministerial brief upon taking office, you were warned of the dangers of further cuts in the capitation grants. Your senior officials in the department said that any further cuts in capitation grants due to budgetary reasons will force many schools into a position where they may not be able to pay the basic utility bills such as lighting and heating. And he went on to say that that creates a risk of some schools closing. Now, why you would not try and reverse that, Minister, I just don't understand it. If you look at the money involved, it was 3.3 million. Even if you take into account the demographic changes next year, you're probably looking at an additional, just under another 2 million. So for the sake of 5.3 million, you could have done away with the cuts in the capitation grant next year, Minister. And I think that 5.3 million would have been well spent, and it would have been well felt in the pockets of parents who unfortunately are going to have to meet that funding shortfall now. The student contribution fee. Again, and I raised it last week with the Minister for Finance, saying that this was a neutral budget and anything that was coming into effect in 2015 didn't have to be accounted for. No, that wasn't the case, and it didn't turn out like that. And unfortunately, the student contribution fee has gone up another €250 next year, Minister, to €3,000. The reality is, Minister, it's going to force more and more students out of education. There's no two ways about it. They may not be huge numbers, but there will be a number of students who unfortunately cannot continue with their higher education as a result of the increased costs. And you didn't even compensate it on the other side by increasing the funding into the Student Assistance Fund. This is a fund that 2 years ago had to be topped up by Minister Rory Quinn. The fund last year ran out within weeks because there was such a demand on it. And it's the same, it's even worse this year, if not the same. It is worse this year because you've had increased rent costs, you've had increased standard or cost of living has gone up in terms of trying to get rents for students, public transport. They're all having an adverse effect on students. I have students coming into my office who are being asked to pay 90, €100 a week rent, and what they're getting in their grant doesn't even cut that. They're working 15, 16 hours a week and trying to study at the same time, and then in the summer they're trying to cram in 40, 45 hours of work just to keep their head above water, living on beans and toast. And that's not me being dramatic, Minister, that is the reality on the ground for many, many students. So I would ask that you would at least look at that particular fund, Minister. Monitor it closely. It's going to run out very, very quickly, and there's going to be a lot of students, unfortunately, if they can't access the Student Assistance Fund, who have no other option but to drop out of education. Now, I know, Minister, that you don't want to see any student drop out of education for any reason. But if there's an opportunity to keep somebody in higher education and to give them that potential or give them the opportunity to reach their potential by increasing that fund, then I would ask that you would look at that very closely. Small schools, disappointed. The summer work scheme, minor works grants not reinstated. Vital sources of funding for many schools. Schools who are, as I said, already facing cuts in capitation and who are going to be going to boards of management, asking them to fundraise, and parents' councils, asking them for increased voluntary contributions, who now may need to do some work in terms of capital projects, in terms of upgrading their heating or fixing a roof, and who relied very, very heavily on those grants in the past. Okay, well that's fair enough, Minister, and I would hope that we would see a positive outcome, because I think it's worked up to about, off the top of my head, I think it's about €7,000 per school, is it? Now that's yeah, so I mean for some schools that is a critical source of funding to enable them just to keep students dry and keep students warm. And I think that's the least we can do, Minister. So I'll leave it at that, Minister, and run out of time. But two things I would ask you to do is, obviously, the minor works grant in November, and also just to look into the Student Assistance Fund, Minister. The money has gone out of it already, and it will probably need a top-up, and if not, students are going to drop out of college.
Thank you, Deputy.